All right, I think we have a good critical mass. So I will go ahead and get us started. Welcome everyone to today's webinar on drinking water protections in Minnesota. My name is Carly Griffith. I am the Water Program Director here at the Minnesota Center for Environmental Advocacy. We are really happy that you're able to join us today. So if you're new to MCEA, we are a legal and policy organization that has worked to protect Minnesota's environment and the health of its people for the past 50 years. We just had our birthday party earlier in the year. And we work on a wide variety of issues from groundwater contamination and agricultural runoff to urban industry pollution and land use in environmental justice communities. We also work to protect communities in northern Minnesota from mining pollution, and we are fighting for strong policies to address climate change. Some of you may have attended our other webinar earlier in the fall focused on our climate change work. Today, we are here to talk about one of Minnesota's most entrenched and persistent water quality issues, which is nitrate pollution of groundwater and drinking water sources. We have had some big news this week. Just yesterday, the Pollution Control Agency released the revised general permit for the largest feedlots in the state. So we will talk about that and much more in our program today. So with us, I'm really excited to welcome our two guest speakers. We have Joy Anderson from MCEA. She is a supervising attorney with us, and Professor Bonnie Keeler with the University of Minnesota. Each has been deeply involved in water work in their careers, which I will, rather than recite their bios to you, I will ask them to tell us directly more about their work as we get into our program. So let me give you a brief roadmap of our conversation today so you know what to expect. For the first 40 minutes or so, I will ask our guests questions about three main topics. First, why nitrate pollution is such an entrenched issue here in Minnesota. Second, how we can continue to protect water at the tap with a focus on legal and economic tools so everyone has access to clean, safe, and affordable drinking water. And third, and probably on a lot of your minds, what to expect with this month's changeover in the presidential administration for Minnesota's water work. And then, of course, we will reserve time at the end for questions from the audience. Finally, webinars like these are made possible because of our individual supporters. Please consider a gift today so we can start 2025 well-resourced to fight for our shared environmental future. There is a link to donate in your chat. So with that, let's go ahead and get started. So as I said, I'm going to ask each of our speakers to tell us a little bit about their work and what led them to this issue. So Joy, let's begin with you. Can you tell us a little bit about yourself and how you came to work on water issues?
Yes. So before I came to MCEA, I was a partner at a big law firm in Minneapolis where I did environmental litigation, but I also did a lot of other kinds of litigation. If you want to know about cemetery law, for a little while, I was our cemetery law expert, believe it or not. But I came to MCEA 5 years ago, and on my first day here, an attorney sat me down and said, your first big project is going to be that you are going to write a long, technically detailed and with a lot of legal analysis comment about nitrate pollution from feedlots. And I was like, that sounds great. What is that? I am from a farming region of the state, but I'm from the northwestern corner where nitrate pollution really isn't as much of a problem. So that wasn't something I was really familiar with. So in the last 5 years, I've learned a lot. Just the super basics of what I learned. Nitrate is a form of nitrogen, which of course is spread on farmlands in order to help crops grow. It's spread on both using manure and commercial fertilizer. Both of those contain nitrogen. If it's not taken up by the crops and used, unfortunately, it can run off over land into surface waters. It can leach down through the ground into the aquifer, and it can go through tile drainage into surface and groundwaters as well. And this is a problem because nitrate is dangerous for people who drink it, animals who drink it, and for fish and other aquatic life that live in it. So since then, since I learned all those very basic things, I have done a lot of work on nitrate pollution. As Carly said, we just found out today that the Pollution Control Agency has put out stricter permits for this state's largest feedlots that add some really common sense things like you have to walk around your field after you spread manure and make sure that the manure is not washing right off into the ditch. Seems pretty basic and pretty easy, and some things we can all agree on. So we're excited to see some of that common sense stuff moving forward, and that is we worked a lot to get even to that point. So we appreciate the work that PCA has done on that. It was exciting news yesterday. But we've also done things like supported counties that wanted to limit the size of their feedlots. We've done some litigation about specific feedlots, and now we're pushing for the state agencies to adopt stricter rules about both manure and commercial fertilizer. So that is some of the work that I have done.
Thank you, Joy. I will ask the same question of you, Dr. Keeler.
Thanks, Carly. So I'm Bonnie Keeler. I teach environmental policy at the Humphrey School at the University of Minnesota, where I also co-direct the Center for Science, Technology, and Environmental Policy. And my work has been on water policy for the last decades or so, and I focus both on state and federal water quality problems. So that means everything from how the Clean Water Council, the Minnesota Department of Health, and MCEA manage water quality in Minnesota, but then also looking at federal policies like the Clean Water Act and the Safe Drinking Water Act. And my work really sits at the intersection of public policy and environmental economics. So the work I do really aims to connect the dots between human activities, that could be industry, the activities of individuals, of agriculture, how those affect our ecosystems, how those affect water quality across a whole variety of different constituents, and the ways in which water quality changes in our lakes and our rivers, streams, and groundwater and drinking water affect human well-being. So that includes recreation, biodiversity, human health, economic development. And then we need to figure out how to communicate those impacts to policymakers and decision makers with the goal of being more informed, more strategic, more efficient, hopefully more equitable, more evidence-based water policy.
Thank you both so much. I'm excited for the expertise that you will bring to our conversation today. So before we get to this month's change in the presidential administration, I'd like to focus our conversation right here in Minnesota. So my first question is for you, Joy. What is the history of MCEA's work on nitrate pollution at the state level? What are some of the primary barriers to progress on this issue, and why is it important to have lawyers involved?
Yes, thank you, Carly. So we know a lot about nitrate pollution. This has been a problem here for a really long time. And I've got a couple of slides here to show you everyone's favorite PowerPoints. So this first slide shows you one thing that we know about nitrate pollution very clearly is that nitrate pollution is very widespread across Minnesota. If you look at this map, this shows places where tests from state agencies have shown that the level of nitrate in the drinking water is above the federal health limit, which is 10 milligrams per liter. You can see that those are clustered in the middle of the state where the soil is really sandy, and in the southeastern part of the state where it has karst geology, which also allows pollution from the surface of the ground to get into the drinking water very quickly. So we also know that the problem is not improving. If you look at this chart, so this is, again, this is from the state agencies. This is a map of nitrate trends in our surface waters for a 10-year period from 2008 to 2017. And as you can see, nitrate pollution around the state was not significantly improving anywhere. In a lot of the state, it was significantly going up, but at best, there was no trend. So it was definitely not improving. So this is a long-term problem that isn't getting better on its own. And we also know what the problem is caused by. This, once again, is a graph from one of our state agencies, and it shows where sorry about that, our lights are motion sensor, and now they went off. But the graph shows that that the sources of nitrate in our drinking water in our surface waters, and 70% of that comes from croplands. It either comes from going into the groundwater from the crops, going through tile drainage, running off over the surface. That graph showed a lot of people say, oh, well, it's not really from the farm fields. It's from septic systems. It's from goose poop. It's from lawn fertilizer. But septic systems are a very small portion of where the nitrate comes from. And goose poop and lawn fertilizer are so small, they're not on the graph at all. So those are not the problem. We know what the problem is. We also know that the state has spent a lot of money trying to combat this problem. In the past 30 years, the state has spent hundreds of millions of dollars trying to combat nitrate pollution. Just from the Clean Water Fund alone, they have spent $148 million since 2010. So it's a lot of money. And what do we have to show for that? As you can see from those maps, not very much. The problem is that the agencies want to use that money to push voluntary solutions, where we pay polluters to pollute less, where we try to educate agricultural producers to get them to adopt things that will decrease nitrate pollution. And those practices are not working. And the state agencies themselves admit these voluntary practices are not working, and we cannot reach our nitrate reduction goals with these practices alone. What we're doing is not enough. But I'm not saying that this is an easy problem to solve. As Carly mentioned about barriers, there are a lot of barriers to change here. The agricultural system is set up to incentivize growing of corn, which is a really leaky crop. It causes a lot of nitrate pollution, kind of no matter how much fertilizer you put on it. And the ag system is set up to incentivize the use of a lot of fertilizers. Farmers feel squeezed. They feel like they can't make changes and still profit from their farming, which obviously is important. And the agricultural industry has a lot of political power. If you look at Minnesota's laws, there are a lot of exceptions for laws that apply to everyone else and don't apply to farmers. And it's really hard for the state agencies to push back against that political power. And so we do recognize there are barriers to this. So because of the long spread, wide-standing problem, because it's not getting better, because of these barriers, MCEA has been working for a long time on this problem. We are trying to get stricter rules about how to spread manure and commercial fertilizer. We were working on those permits for feedlots that we were talking about. And one really important thing that happened was in 2023, MCEA and a lot of other community groups, we had a lot of support from people who are experiencing these problems and who live in the karst region and want clean water to drink. So we formed a group with all of those petitioners, and together we wrote a petition to the Federal Environmental Protection Agency and said, hey, this is a problem. People have drinking water that's not safe for them to drink. You need to take action and do something about this. And the EPA did. They told our state agencies, you are not doing enough. You need to do something to get clean water immediately to people who need it. And you need to take steps to hold nitrate sources accountable and address the long-term problem. And since then, our state agencies have taken some action. The legislature last session appropriated about $16 million to address nitrate issues. The Minnesota Department of Health started a program to test wells and provide bottled water or safe sources of drinking water to people who have unsafe water. The rollout for that has gone slower and it's had less reach than we would have perhaps hoped, but that has been started. And MPCA has said, the Pollution Control Agency, we environmental attorneys speak in a lot of acronyms. The Pollution Control Agency has said that it is going to look at things like, it's already put out these stricter permits for the largest feedlots, and it said it's going to look at some rule changes as well. But we need a lot more progress. This is just the beginning. MCEA thinks that the place that we need to push next is to make changes to administrative rules about spreading manure and about applying commercial fertilizer. So backing up for 1 second, what are administrative rules? Administrative rules are laws that are issued by state agencies, like the Pollution Control Agency, like the Department of Agriculture. When the legislature recognizes that it doesn't have technical expertise in a specific area, we probably don't want our legislators sitting down and trying to figure out what exact specifications should there be on the liner for a liquid manure storage area to make sure that that's all the manure isn't seeping into the ground, right? So that's not something that the legislators are going to know much about. But the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency does. So the legislature tells the state agency, look, we need rules in this area. We're giving you the authority to go and set these rules. And so then the state agency has a whole big public process where people can comment, members of the public can comment, interested groups can comment. They have to put out a big document that talks about why they need this rule and why this rule is reasonable and why it accomplishes the goals that they have. And then after that, they put out the rules and they become the law. And we do have some rules here. The Minnesota Pollution Control Agency has rules for feedlots that apply to all feedlots, not just the largest ones like these permits do. And the Minnesota Department of Agriculture has the groundwater protection rule, which does place some limits on how commercial fertilizer can be used. And so we have rules already. The feedlot rules are quite old. The groundwater protection rule is only 5 years old, but has not accomplished very much in the 5 years it's been in existence. And so we think that that's the next part where we need to move things forward, is to push for changes to these rules.
Thank you, Joy. We get really excited about administrative rules and regulations here at MCEA, but I think they really are an important frontier of change on this issue. And I will say that we saw a lot of community members come out to comment on the feedlot permits that were recently revised. So we know that this is an issue of broad public interest, and we really appreciate everyone who takes the time to submit comments like that. So I would now like to shift from the law to economics. So Dr. Keeler, you have done a lot of work on what you call the social cost of nitrogen. I would like for you to help us understand that term and why it's important to quantify the social cost of pollution broadly. What does that mean? And why is it an important policy tool? And then finally, what do the latest numbers on the social cost of nitrogen look like here for Minnesota?
Great, thanks, Carly. And I think you're going to pull up my slides. So the reason we care about quantifying social costs is they can be really powerful tools for informing regulatory review and particularly benefit cost analysis. So at the federal level, for major rules or regulations, the feds have to do a benefit cost test. They have to demonstrate that the benefits of that proposed rule or regulation exceed the costs associated with implementing the rule. We don't require strict benefit cost tests at the state level, but we do care about being good stewards of public resources and making sure that we're passing policies that are efficient, that are effective, that are making getting the best return on investment, the best bang for our buck. And being able to quantify things like the social costs of carbon or the social costs of climate pollution have been incredibly powerful tools, legal tools and policy tools that have allowed for the advancement of policies that have really accelerated our ability to protect the environment. These are costs that aren't borne by markets. And so we have to figure out creative ways to quantify the real impacts that climate change and pollution can have on communities. So these are just a couple of examples of real important progress in the policy and legal spheres that have resulted of our ability to quantify social costs. So the Biden administration has relied heavily on estimates of the social cost of carbon to promote tools and policies to fight climate change. And we know that states are using updated social costs of carbon measures to advance in our own public utility commissions to think about a more strategic permitting of different types of energy sources. So it allows a state to invest more in clean energy as opposed to relying on coal and natural gas. Next slide. So while we've made really big progress, significant legal and policy progress through the better quantification of the social cost of carbon, we have not done as much on quantifying the social costs of water pollution. And this is a real gap if we want to continue to invest in more stringent water quality rules and regulations. If we can't quantify what the benefits of those rules and regulations are, then it inhibits our ability to advance those more protective policies. So a brief primer on some of the social costs of nitrogen. That nitrogen moves through the environment. It takes lots of different forms. And in those different forms, it affects human well-being in different ways. So as farmers apply fertilizer to their fields, some of that nitrogen actually ends up being volatilized and converted to N2O, which is a very potent greenhouse gas. So it can contribute to climate change damages. And nitrogen is also volatilized into ammonia, which can lead to particulate matter. And it's an air pollution problem for downwind communities. The focus of this conversation is about when nitrogen moves into water, and it could go into both surface water or into groundwater. And that means that it's either affecting aquatic systems and aquatic life. It's affecting the Gulf of Mexico, the hypoxia problem there. And then it's also being consumed by drinking water consumers, whether you rely on a private well or you get your water through a public water supplier. Next slide. So if you're on a private well, like actually I am here in southern Minnesota in Rice County, then you face some costs associated with that nitrate contamination. So this is some work that I did about a decade ago, looking at the impacts on private well owners associated with agricultural expansion in southeast Minnesota, which faces a lot of the nitrate problems that Joy and Carly mentioned at the beginning. So these are households that either have to build a new well, they have to buy bottled water, they have to purchase and install and use a reverse osmosis system. But the point here is that these come with real costs to households when they face nitrate contamination. Next slide. In addition to private well owners, public water suppliers also across the nation are seeing increased costs associated with nitrate contamination. So here are just two news articles, one talking about a Nebraska town where annual maintenance costs for their drinking water treatment system are as high as $650 per person. And so the state has to fund millions of dollars in water projects to protect clean water for very few residents. Often these are affecting rural communities disproportionately, where the cost of treating water is quite expensive and it has to be borne by just a handful of households. And then Des Moines has had lots of high profile cases around the contamination of their water supply by nitrate. And this article talks about how it can cost up to $10,000 a day to operate their nitrate removal system. Next slide. In addition to the direct costs of trying to treat for nitrate or avoid nitrate, if you're a private well owner, nitrate exposure can also lead to adverse health outcomes. And when your health is impacted by exposure to a pollutant, that can come with associated costs. And so this is a work that's just currently in review. And along with Taryn Meyer, who's a PhD graduate of the Humphrey School, looked at a variety of different conditions associated with nitrate exposure in drinking water. And those are listed here, and they include everything from adverse birth outcomes like neural tube defects to low birth weight to certain types of cancers. And then other non-cancer conditions like macular degeneration and hypothyroidism. These are all things that have been studied. Their association with nitrate in drinking water have been studied in the epidemiological and public health literature. So we took a look at the relative risk ratios of how nitrogen increases the public health risks of those different types of conditions, estimated for each public water supply in Minnesota, the baseline level of the incidence of those diseases by the population served by those public water suppliers, how exposure to increased level of nitrate might increase the risk factors for those diseases, and then how many additional cases of those diseases or conditions we expect might occur in those populations if nitrate exposure were to increase. And then economists have a variety of tools to value those. We can look at the direct medical costs that people incur for those conditions, premature mortalities, if you have an end of life because of a cancer that's fatal, or quality adjusted life years, which accounts for the quality of life impacts of being exposed to these health outcomes. Next slide. And the bottom line here is that when you start to value all of these potential health damages associated with exposure to nitrate in drinking water, we find a pretty significant cost, social costs, and we estimate over $5 billion annually in Minnesota that's attributed to potential nitrate-related health damages. And this graph on the left just shows how those costs increase as public water suppliers face additional amounts of nitrate in their source water. So the costs really accelerate as the concentration of nitrate that people are exposed to increases. And we're seeing annual costs that are on the range of other really important public health issues like air pollution and fatal car crashes. And then just a couple of notes here on this work. It's based just on communities that are served by public water suppliers. It doesn't include folks who are on private wells. And that we are seeing a lot of damages occur below the federal drinking water standard of 10 milligrams per liter. So even if your water supply has lower levels of nitrate, 4 parts per million, 5, 7, we are estimating significant health damages associated with exposure to nitrate. And that all of these impacts are predominantly felt by rural communities where they're in agricultural landscapes, and they'll also tend to be lower income communities that are least well equipped to deal with the both public health and financial impacts of these costs.
Thank you so much for that foundation in what it means to look at the social costs of pollution and the gap that we have for water pollution compared to how we've been able to connect the social cost of carbon to policy outcomes. So now I would like to zoom out from Minnesota to the federal landscape. So in a very short period of time, there will be a change in the presidential administration. And the new administration has made it clear that it plans to dismantle environmental regulations at the federal level. So my question for both of you is, how do you anticipate this will impact work on water issues like nitrate pollution here in Minnesota? You mentioned, for example, Joy, that MCEA and other organizations had petitioned the federal EPA on this issue. And are there any opportunities that we can prepare ourselves for to advance water work over the next 4 years? So this is for both of you.
Yeah, thanks, Carly. So, I mean, the reality of water policy in the US is that much of the authority to regulate water quality, and that includes investments in monitoring and enforcement, that authority is delegated to states. So the federal government sets the minimum standards, but states really play a leadership role in deciding how they will approach water quality issues in their state and in their region. So it's also important to remember that federal legislation, as mentioned earlier, like the Clean Water Act, exempts agricultural runoff from permit requirements. And so non-point source pollution issues like nitrogen have never been really regulated under the Clean Water Act, and that's not going to change under the next administration. At the same time, what we did see under the last Trump administration were a lot of rollbacks about protection. There were a lot of delisting of waters of the US. So there was a contraction in the extent of waterways that were considered for federal protection. And this had less of an impact in Minnesota, but removed many ephemeral streams and lots of wetlands across this nation, especially in the Southwest, from federal protection. We also saw a real dismantling of the EPA's Science Advisory Board structure under the Trump administration, and much more deference to industry within the agency. So I think we'll be paying attention to how they think about the role of science and expertise within the way that they're deciding to make agency decisions. And that has huge implications for the sort of rulemaking and regulatory processes that happen behind the scenes at agencies like EPA. If you contrast that with what we saw under the Biden administration, where there was real leadership, I think, across the board on a number of water quality issues. So I'm thinking about progress around PFAS, real investment in elevating environmental justice concerns and water-related issues, and strengthening the capacity of tribes to exert authority over clean water problems, both on reservations and in ceded territories. So the point is that states have historically led the way on water policy, and that will continue to be the case under the next administration. However, what we don't expect to see is much leadership on the federal level. So that means states are going to be really on the hook when it comes to managing any kind of water pollution problem, and that includes nitrate.
Yes, I would just second all of what Bonnie said. First of all, that yes, the feds are going to be less helpful now, and so the states are going to have to lead the way. As Carly said, and as I mentioned before, we had worked with the Federal Environmental Protection Agency on nitrate pollution in our state, and the EPA was really helpful. The letter that they sent to our state agencies saying, you all have to work together to come up with a plan to address nitrate pollution, that was really critical. And that gave the agencies a really big nudge to move forward that they, in areas that they were not thinking about before that. However, we can expect that the EPA will be less helpful starting next month. But as Bonnie said, I guess don't want to say that's okay, but we need to look to the state, and we have strong state laws in place already that we can use. We don't need the federal law. We don't need the federal EPA to push things forward. We don't need federal laws. We can clean up and protect our water with the laws that we have in Minnesota now. We have the Groundwater Protection Act, which was passed 30 years ago, which tells the Minnesota Department of Agriculture that it needs to take steps to address nitrate pollution from fertilizer. We have the Water Pollution Control Act for our pollution control agency and some other statutes that give PCA the power to really the duty and the authority to set rules, to issue permits that prevent and control water pollution. But if agencies won't do that on their own, and sometimes they're not super excited about using the authority they've been given, we have lawyers that will help push things forward. We can give things a little nudge. And one of the tools that we have to do that with is the Minnesota Environmental Rights Act. Again, this is a state statute, doesn't have anything to do with the feds. And it's a law that doesn't have a federal analog, and most states don't have an analog to it either. And this law says that if there is a state standard or rule or permit that is not adequate to protect our environment from pollution, we can bring a lawsuit, and the court can tell the agency, you need to go back and look at that rule because that rule is not adequate to protect the environment. And then the agency has to go back and look at that. And so that's a really powerful tool and a really powerful way that the public can tell an agency and tell the state, look, you are not doing enough. We want stronger, better rules that protect our water, that protect our environment, that make sure that we have safe drinking water that we need to have. So that's, I guess I sort of launched into a little bit of a different area there, but we can move forward regardless of what's happening at the federal level.
Yeah, I think that, first of all, the overview of delegated authority that Bonnie gave us is really helpful to understand why state movement on this issue is so important in an environment where the feds are expected to roll back environmental regulations. And then also, Joy, I think what you spoke to really answered my question about what opportunities are there for us to advance water work over the next 4 years here in Minnesota. One point that I want to add that is specific to the EPA petition that has come up a couple of times here. If people are interested to learn more about where the state agency response is to that petition, there was a legislative auditor report that was released on New Year's Eve on December 31st. It's publicly available. It's an 8-page document. But the too long don't read takeaway is that it evaluates how well this Minnesota State Agency work plan that was released last January, in January 2024, addresses the specific issues that the EPA outlined when it responded to the petition submitted by MCEA and 10 other environmental and public health groups. And the takeaway was that the work plan addresses almost all of the immediate public health measures that the EPA called out in its letter. But it is not clear at this point that the state's long-term strategy to reduce nitrogen sources to groundwater fully addresses the EPA's expectations. So this is where MCEA plans to focus its continued efforts on this issue. And it's why tools like administrative regulations are so important. So we have had a lot of excellent questions come in, so please keep those coming. I'm going to get to those very shortly. But before I do, I have one more question for both of you. Just to wrap this up and move into our next section. So groundwater protection is a complex but increasingly critical issue here in Minnesota. We have increased demand on our aquifers from water-intensive industries, from agricultural irrigation to data centers. We also have new sources of contamination like PFAS or forever chemicals. There's a lot in the news on that right now, as Amara's law has just gone into effect this month. But unlike some of these newer challenges, nitrate pollution is an area where we have known both about the risks and the practices that can effectively reduce that risk for a really long time. So with that in mind, as a last topic here, how would each of you recommend that we advance work on this issue here in Minnesota? Bonnie, I'll go to you first.
Yeah, I mean, as you said, nitrogen and agricultural runoff in particular are really persistent challenges, and in part because they rely on the actions of many distributed individuals across large scales. And the incentive structures that we have in agriculture make it really challenging to transform those landscapes, to adopt practices that might differentially affect yields or expose farmers and producers to financial risks. And that's part of the reason that our voluntary programs have largely failed to move the needle on agriculture. I do think Minnesota has some success stories. If you look at mandatory, more regulatory approaches like the buffer rule, we now have over 98% compliance of landowners with that policy. So we've shown that when you take action, you can actually significantly impact landscapes. But at the same time, I think it's also important to recognize that we're not going to easily buy our way out of this nitrogen problem. You know, if you just look at, we did some analysis on the Clean Water Fund, which expires in 2034. There's about $1.6 billion potentially left in that fund to spend before it expires. And we did some analysis of just how much it would cost to meet the stated goals of that fund through its expiration. And we estimated that there's over $6 billion in goals stated in that strategic plan, which far exceeds the amount of money that we expect to have available in that fund. And if you look at what we passed this session to address the nitrate issue, we're talking about, $2.8 million to help alleviate the costs of private well owners, and $2.8 million for an inventory to test and do education and outreach, and $3 million to monitor. And those are all good investments. But when you compare them to the scale of the problem, we estimated over $5 billion annually in health damages associated with nitrate. They're really just not at the same order of magnitude that we would need to address the scale of the problem. So these are expensive problems to deal with, and it's the money that we currently have in the state isn't sufficient to just buy our way out of the challenges that we face when it comes to nitrogen.
Yes, again, agree with all of that. We do know what we can do to help address nitrate pollution, requiring better practices in the vulnerable areas of that state, the map that I showed at the very beginning, where the nitrate pollution's in the middle of the state and the nitrate pollution's in the southeast corner, right? So if we can focus on those areas, that's really important. If we can get people to just apply less fertilizer, that helps nitrate pollution. If you use cover crops, that helps too. If you plant different crops and not just corn all the time. If you keep things away, if you keep the fertilizer away from, sinkholes and ditches and like the buffer lot that Bonnie mentioned, there are things that we know will work. But the problem is, as Bonnie said, we can't pay people enough to adopt those. We can't just buy our way out of this problem. We need widespread adoption of a lot of practices that will help. And there's not one silver bullet, right? Like it's got to be a lot of people adopting a lot of practices. And that's one of the reasons that we think that regulation, like common sense additions to regulations, can raise just the bottom of like what's acceptable for everyone. And if you raise the floor so that everyone's participating together, then you can make progress on this really big, really persistent, really difficult problem. And everyone needs to work on that together. And that includes all of you. I mean, I told this to Carly yesterday, but this sounds sort of corny, but it just really warmed my heart to go through all the comments on the feedlot permits and see how many people took time to write in and tell MPCA, this is something that's important. You need to do something about it, right? Like that's my job. And so I get paid to do it. But all these people that aren't getting paid to do it took the time and really thought about this and wrote into MPCA, and that made a difference. MPCA made real changes in their feedlot permit, and they would not have done that in the face of opposition from the agricultural industry unless they knew that people in Minnesota cared about this. So thank you to the people who did that. If you want to get involved, there are going to be more opportunities to comment on things like that. You can always call your legislator and let them know this is something that's important to me. I mean, we've talked to legislators who say, even if like 10 people call me on a thing, that feels really, that feels the sort of a flood of information to me, right? Like not that many people are calling their legislators about things. And so there are a lot of things that you can do. This legislative system, this legislative session is going to be a little different from the last one. As we all know, things are going to happen there and don't even know yet what's happening. But there's still a part for you to play. We are hoping that eventually there will be changes to rules that are proposed. We keep talking about those administrative rules. We hope that there's going to be changes to those. Super important for the agencies to hear from all of you when that happens, to say, this is important to me. We need to make these changes. We need to work together to protect our water so that everyone in Minnesota has clean, safe water that they can drink.
Thank you both. And I would just add, in terms of legislative session, that kicks off next week. There is some uncertainty, some added uncertainty. We have 2 special elections planned for the end of January at this point. But we do anticipate that this issue will be active this session, both with the recent feedlot permits that were finalized yesterday, and the need for more investment in public health measures like mitigation support for private well owners. So if you want to stay informed on these topics or be involved, please sign up for our newsletters and action alerts. That's where we let people know about opportunities to participate. And we also have a new legislative director here at MCEA named Ben, who we're really excited to welcome back to the state of Minnesota. And you'll see an email from us soon to lay out our legislative agenda for session and with more opportunities to be involved. So with that, I would like to turn to audience Q&A. Thank you to everyone who has submitted questions in the Q&A box. Please continue to do so. And what I will do is get to as many as I can. We have one here. So I think this one I'm going to give to you, Bonnie. 2 parts to this question. First, if you could speak to some of the equity impacts of nitrate water pollution. You mentioned how it tends to impact smaller rural communities, whether it's private well owners or people on smaller community water supplies where the burden of increased treatment costs is harder to bear. So which communities have faced greater risk and lack of access to resources? And then we had a question whether you've done a similar social cost assessment for private well owners to the one that you shared with us for public water supplies.
Sure. Yeah. So, we know that nitrate affects different parts of the state differentially. And because of the geologic conditions of the state, that's primarily in the sandy soils in the central part of the state and in the karst topography in the southeast. Those are also places where there's a lot of rural communities and small communities where there are a few number of households that are served by a water treatment plant. And so those costs of investing in an expensive reverse osmosis system or digging and finding a new water source or connecting to a new water source, those are huge expenses for communities. And there's just not enough tax base to really support those investments. So that can just put a huge burden on communities and households to maintain that kind of infrastructure, in addition to the health costs. So if you are experiencing health impacts associated with the low quality of water in your drinking water, and that could be nitrate or any other contaminants that you're exposed to. And we also have problems with those communities maybe not being aware of the level of nitrate that's in their drinking water or other types of contaminants. They may not have differential access to interventions, public health, good primary care. We know that these conditions often differentially affect kids and the elderly and people who have other types of adverse health conditions. So it sort of layers on, impacts that rural communities already have fewer resources to deal with, and that has big equity implications. And then the question about private well owners, I think this is, we know that a lot of people don't test their well, not just for nitrate, but arsenic is another huge issue. And that's a naturally occurring contaminant, but it can have pretty significant health impacts. And people don't know necessarily what's in their drinking water. There's reasons for that, and sometimes even people know that their well is contaminated. They're not taking the mitigation steps to deal with it. We haven't run the same numbers for private wells, but we certainly could. It would be really similar types of calculations. It's a little bit harder to know exactly how much people are exposed to in private wells because we don't require them to test and report what the levels are of different contaminants, whereas public water suppliers really have to test the source water that they're supplying to their communities. So there's an additional data challenge with private well owners.
And one thing I will add to that is there is a new faculty member who recently started at McAllister in St. Paul, who has looked at private well costs in Iowa and has published a study about that. So I would recommend his work. Gabe Lang, I believe is his name. And he's done some work on those costs in Iowa. So for this next question, I would like to go to Joy. So we have a question here. MPCA was charged with creating a rule to set standards for nitrate in surface waters to protect aquatic life in 2010. They spent the money that was allocated by the legislature, but never submitted a rule. What is the status of this rulemaking, and can we advance the effort?
Yeah, that's such a good question. Yeah, so we have this 10 milligrams per liter health limit for what's called class 1 waters, waters that are for drinking water, and that includes all the groundwater in the state. But for surface waters, for class 2, what's called class 2 waters is most of the surface waters in the state, waters that can support aquatic life, basically. We don't have a specific nitrate standard for those, even though, as you say, MPCA did get money to develop one. They did say, oh, we think it should probably be 8 milligrams per liter in all waters and then 5 milligrams per liter in these specific waters. And they never implemented it because it was really low and everyone freaked out and they didn't know how they were going to reach that standard, basically. And because the nitrate sources are so diffuse, it is difficult, as we've been saying, to address it. So they put it off. And then they announced a couple of years ago that they were going to do it. Again, they announced it. And again, they updated their technical document. And then they didn't do it again. And now their website says we are going to rethink a holistic approach to nitrate pollution in Minnesota before we set a nitrate standard for our surface waters. So right now, it's going exactly nowhere. I think that would be a great thing to push on and to try to get MPCA to do. We are right now focused on like the feedlot rules, which we think could move things forward. But yeah, we have definitely told MPCA that we think that they should put together a nitrate standard like that. They've got the document that says what it should be. Just implement it.
And one thing that I will add is that there's currently the MPCA plans to begin the triennial water quality standards review here shortly. So every 3 years, they do a review of water quality standards in the state and propose amendments that are then subject to EPA approval. Their draft work plan is currently published on their website, and there is, again, another reference to Class 2 water quality standards for nitrate as part of their work plan. And there's a comment period that is associated with that. So I think the best opportunity to push for that right now is an active comment period with the Pollution Control Agency to say, yes, we support this in your work plan. We think you should prioritize this. This is an important way to make progress. So that's an opportunity available right now. Okay, so we have a question here that, we talked about some of the challenges with the carrot approach through voluntary adoption programs, where we haven't seen the level of adoption that we would need to move the needle. So does the state have the power, absent federal, separate federal authorization, to use a stick approach? So Joy, I think I'll hand this to you in terms of what the state laws already are on the books.
Yeah, they for sure do. We have the Groundwater Protection Act, which was passed, 1989 or 1990. So it's a long time ago, right? Like it's been on the books for a long time. And it says specifically, if you try voluntary actions and they don't move the needle on pollution, then the Minnesota Department of Agriculture has the authority to pass further rules that would institute regulatory mandatory kinds of solutions. So yes, for sure, MDA has the power to do that. They have passed a groundwater protection rule, which shows that they know they have that authority and that they have tried to exercise that authority to some extent. But we think that they can go a lot further and make that rule a lot stronger so that it has a much bigger impact than it is right now. And yes, the Pollution Control Agency has authority over feedlots. It has the authority to pass rules for feedlots, and it has the authority to pass rules about how manure is spread. They do have a rule that talks about that. And again, they can do more. There's very broad authority that MPCA has to, they're just given the authority to do something like, you can pass rules to prevent and control and abate water pollution, right? That's a very broad authority. They can do a lot with that authority. And we think that there's more that they can do.
Great, so I'm going to group a few different questions together into one here. And this one is for you, Bonnie. So you talked about when you looked at some of the social costs of nitrogen updated numbers, relative risk factors for adverse health outcomes that are below the federal limit of 10 micrograms per liter. So, are there efforts at the federal level or at the state level to consider lower standards for the health impacts of nitrate pollution? And if so, what are the status of those efforts?
Yeah, it's a tricky one. Most of the standards that we currently have are really built around blue baby syndrome. And they haven't been updated or revised based on evolving public health and epidemiological work on a whole host of other adverse health conditions. I will note that a lot of this is really preliminary work. It's very difficult to do a public health study where you control for all the potential sources of nitrate that a household or a community might consume. We have nitrates in some of our food stuff, and there's other risk factors that are associated with these types of conditions. So to actually draw, the highest standard of evidence that EPA is going to be looking for when they're trying to establish a more stringent water quality standard, the work that we have on nitrate is fairly sparse. There's not a lot of researchers that are working on it, and it has a relatively fewer number of studies than we do by the impacts of, for example, particulate matter on human health. So I think it's in its nascent stage. I don't think the public health literature has evolved to the point where EPA at least believes that there's a sufficient standard of evidence that's been met. I think the goal for our team was to say, hey, we shouldn't count these health costs to be zero. right? There is research that's evolving that says that there are associations with nitrate exposure and these different types of adverse health conditions beyond just some of the cancers. I think the largest numbers we saw were with some of these direct medical costs and low birth outcomes. So if we assume that even there's some increased risk and we try to quantify the costs associated with that increased risk, we end up with quite significant numbers. And so that points to the seriousness of taking a look at this issue. And I do hope that we continue to see that literature evolve and a real collaboration between the public health and epidemiological and toxicology communities to try and determine what is a safe level of nitrogen in the water that people consume.
And did you mention the IRIS risk assessment, Bonnie? There's a branch of the EPA called the Integrated Risk something. IRIS is the acronym, and they had begun a assessment of nitrite health risks. That was suspended under the Trump administration. It was restarted under the Biden administration, and it now has an uncertain status. So there has been some effort within the IRIS and in states like Iowa to look more closely at some of these additive risk factors at levels below the current federal standard. So there is an increase in some of this research. So I am going to give this one to Joy. So people are interested to hear a little bit more about the general feedlot permit. What are a couple of key changes that should help protect water that we saw in the permit released yesterday?
Yeah, so we were excited to see some of these steps. Again, don't think they go far enough. We think we need more, but it's great to see any steps forward by the agency. And some of the things that they did are focused on those specific vulnerable areas. Again, referring back to that map that I showed you at the beginning, we know where the nitrate pollution is the worst in the central part of the state, in the southeastern part of the state. And in areas where MPCA has determined that the geology makes it particularly vulnerable to nitrate pollution, they have required more best management practices for, in particular, fall spreading of manure, because farmers have time in the fall. They spread a whole bunch of manure in the fall because that's their pit is full. They've got time to do it. But then there's no crop to take it up, right? And so all that nitrate is sitting in the ground or on top of the ground throughout the winter. There's a lot of opportunity for it to go into the groundwater, to run off. And so they're requiring things like putting on cover crops, waiting until the ground is cool enough so that the nitrate doesn't change, so that the nitrogen doesn't change forms. That I'm getting too technical. That doesn't matter. But the point is that they're requiring more specific kinds of practices in those areas to make sure that less nitrogen pollution happens. They are requiring at least some visual monitoring of manure spreading. So when you spread your manure in the field, at the end of the day, you have to walk around the field and make sure that there's not manure running off into the ditch or running off into the sinkhole or something like that. And that wasn't even required before. So we think that's a good step. Gosh, now Carly, now I'm blanking. You hit this to me and now I'm blanking on the other things that there are.
Did you touch on transferred manure requirements?
Oh, transferred manure. Yeah, that's the other really important one. Is that previously, if a farmer sold manure to someone else, there were a lot less restrictions on how that someone else could use the manure than there were on the feedlot owner themselves. And so now when you sell that manure, you still have to follow the same kinds of requirements that the feedlot owner themselves would have had to follow. And we think that's really important because that was a huge loophole for people. So that's just some of the things, that's kind of the main things I think that were incorporated into those feedlot permits.
Well, we are now at time, so I'm going to wrap us up here. One thing I'm going to say is I've seen in the chat several comments about, what are the best opportunities to act right now and to put resources in now. So I want to extend a thank you again to all who commented on the feedlot permits that was open this summer. As we've said a few times here, MCEA plans to focus its continued efforts on administrative rules now. And then we've addressed permits for the largest feedlots, shift to administrative rules for feedlots and for commercial fertilizer. So once any potential rulemaking is opened, there will be a similar need for active community involvement. We will also share the link to that currently active comment period that I mentioned for the triennial water quality standards review in our follow-up email to everyone. We're going to email everyone with a recorded version of the webinar so that you can have these resources at hand. So with that, thank you everyone for your attention and for your questions. And a big thank you also to our panelists for being here today and for your expertise. That is going to wrap up our program, but one last mention is that webinars like this one and all of the work that we do at MCEA are only possible because of individual supporters. So please consider donating so that we can start 2025 well-resourced to fight for our shared environmental future. So thank you, everyone. I'm sorry we couldn't get to all the questions. There were a lot of them. But if you want to follow up with MCEA, you can feel free to reach out to me. Thank you for your time.
Thank you.